September 7th, 1191. The pre-dawn darkness along the Mediterranean coast hides an impossible nightmare. 20,000 crusaders stretch across 12 miles of burning sand between the sea and death, their columns so thin that a single coordinated attack could slice it into helpless fragments. Every step south from Acre brings them deeper into Saladin's trap. The air shimmers at 110 degrees Fahrenheit by sunrise. Knights in 80 pounds of steel armor cook inside their mail like meat in an oven. Horses collapse every quarter mile, their riders forced to continue on foot or die where they fall. Picture this: you're a Crusader knight, watching the horizon dance with heat mirages, knowing that somewhere beyond your vision, 30,000 Muslim warriors are positioning themselves for the killing blow. Richard the Lionheart's gamble defied every principle of medieval warfare, marching 20,000 men along a narrow coastal strip with hostile territory on one side and the sea on the other, violated the most basic rule of military survival: never trap yourself against an obstacle. Yet here he was, leading the largest Crusader army, assembled since the disaster at Hattin 4 years earlier, stretched impossibly thin along the ancient road to Jaffa. The mathematics were terrifying. His column extended 12 miles from vanguard to rearguard, a distance so vast that a message took 2 hours to travel from front to back. At any given moment, half his army couldn't see the other half. If Saladin struck the center, the Crusaders would be fighting 3 separate battles with no hope of mutual support. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Richard had no choice. Behind them lay the smoking ruins of coastal fortifications that Saladin had systematically destroyed. Ahead waited Jaffa, the only port between Acre and Egypt capable of supplying a major army. Without Jaffa, the Third Crusade would starve to death within months. The English king had calculated that his 20,000 troops could reach the port in 5 days of forced marching. What he hadn't calculated was that Saladin would be waiting with the largest Muslim army assembled since the reconquest of Jerusalem. The enemy force shadowing their march was beyond comprehension. 30,000 warriors moved like a dark tide through the hills, paralleling the coast road. Saladin's host included 12,000 Turkish horse archers, whose composite bows could pierce mail at 200 yards. 8,000 Kurdish and Arab heavy cavalry carried lances that could punch through shield and body with a single thrust. 10,000 infantry and support troops completed an army that had crushed every Christian force it encountered for 4 consecutive years. The psychological warfare had already begun. Every morning, the Crusaders woke to the distant thunder of Muslim war drums echoing from the hills. Every evening, they watched signal fires bloom across the horizon like fallen stars. Saladin's commanders coordinating the movements of forces the Christians couldn't see or count. The heat was killing more Crusaders than Muslim arrows. Men collapsed in their armor, dragged unconscious from the column by comrades who could barely walk themselves. Water sources had been poisoned or destroyed by retreating Muslim forces. The precious few wells they encountered produced brackish liquid that left men retching and weak. Richard himself rode at the column's center, his royal banner, a target visible for miles, constantly calculating distances, casualties, and time. His scouts reported the same terrifying intelligence hour after hour. Muslim forces closing from 3 directions, the trap tightening with every step south. On the morning of September 6th, everything changed. Crusader outriders reported that Saladin's entire army had moved to block the coastal road ahead. 30,000 warriors positioned themselves between the Christian army and Jaffa, cutting off the only route to salvation. The trap was complete. Richard faced an impossible choice: attack a force that outnumbered him 3-2 across open ground, where Muslim cavalry superiority would be decisive, or attempt a fighting withdrawal back to Acre through territory now swarming with enemy scouts. Either option meant probable annihilation. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. Richard, despite barely remaining conscious from heat exhaustion and dysentery, had distributed his forces throughout the 12-mile column, in a formation so revolutionary it would change medieval warfare forever. As dawn broke on September the 7th, Saladin's crescent formation emerged from the morning mist like a vision of apocalypse. 30,000 warriors arranged themselves across the coastal plain in a perfect killing arc, their polished weapons catching the first rays of sunlight. The sight that greeted Richard's exhausted scouts defied comprehension. From the hills above Arsuf to the very edge of the Mediterranean, an unbroken line of cavalry, archers, and infantry stretched for over 2 miles. Saladin had committed his entire force to this single, decisive engagement. The Sultan's tactical genius was immediately apparent. His right wing, commanded by his nephew Taqi al-Din, positioned 10,000 Kurdish cavalry on elevated ground that dominated the coastal road. These were veteran horsemen who had shattered Christian armies from Damascus to Cairo, their lances gleaming like a steel forest in the rising sun. Saladin himself commanded the center with 8,000 Mamluk guards, the elite slave soldiers whose discipline and ferocity had become legendary across the Islamic world. Each Mamluk represented years of training and a fortune in equipment, warriors who knew no retreat and accepted no quarter. But it was the left wing that would prove most deadly. 7,000 Turkish horse archers spread across the plain like a dark tide, their composite bows capable of loosing 15,000 arrows per minute at maximum rate. Behind them moved 5,000 infantry carrying the black banners of jihad, volunteers who had traveled from across the Muslim world for the chance to drive Christianity from the Holy Land forever. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Even if every Christian fought with superhuman skill, the numbers guaranteed Muslim victory. Here's what the Muslim chroniclers don't tell you about that morning. Saladin had spent the previous night in prayer, not from religious devotion, but from genuine uncertainty about the outcome. 4 years of constant warfare against the Crusaders had taught him to respect their desperate courage. Richard's reputation preceded him like a storm front, and the Sultan knew that cornered Crusaders fought with the fury of men who expected paradise or death with equal anticipation. By the 3rd hour after sunrise, the psychological assault began. Muslim drummers positioned throughout the crescent started a rhythmic pounding that could be heard 5 miles away. The sound rolled across the plain like distant thunder, punctuated by the high wailing of horns and the battle cries of 30,000 voices raised in unison. The effect on Christian morale was immediate and devastating. Horses reared and fought their bridles. Men crossed themselves repeatedly, and whispered prayers became audible throughout the column. Then came the arrows. 15,000 Turkish horsemen began circling the Crusader formation at extreme range, each man loosing arrows as quickly as he could draw and release. The mathematics of this sustained barrage were terrifying. At full intensity, the Muslim archers could maintain a rate of 30,000 arrows per minute, a steel rain that turned the morning sky dark. Crusader shields sprouted arrow shafts like porcupine quills. Horses screamed and fell, their riders crushed beneath armored bodies or left afoot in the growing chaos. What happened next pushed the Christian army to its breaking point. Saladin ordered his cavalry to begin probing attacks, testing the Crusader formation for weaknesses. 500 Kurdish horsemen would charge directly at a section of the line, wheel away at the last moment, then attack from a different angle. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Knights gripped their reins until their knuckles went white, watching enemies approach and retreat without being able to strike back. The most vulnerable point was the rearguard, where the Knights Hospitaller fought a desperate holding action against increasingly aggressive Muslim assaults. Brother Gagne de Nablus, the Hospitaller marshal, watched his mounted brothers fall one by one to the endless arrow storm. By midday, half his knights had lost their war horses and fought on foot, their heavy armor becoming a death sentence in the scorching heat. Richard himself was beginning to crack under the impossible pressure. Witnesses reported seeing the king swaying in his saddle, heat exhaustion, and dysentery combining with the stress of command to push him toward collapse. Yet every time his subordinates begged permission to charge, to break the suffocating defensive posture and strike back at their tormentors, Richard's answer remained the same. Hold formation, wait for the perfect moment, let them come to us. But discipline was fracturing like glass under pressure, and Saladin could sense it. At 11 o'clock on that blazing September morning, the breaking point arrived with mathematical precision. Brother Gagne de Nablus, marshal of the Knights Hospitaliers, watched the last of his mounted brothers fall to Turkish arrows. 43 knights reduced to 17 in less than 3 hours. The rearguard was disintegrating under pressure that no medieval formation had ever been designed to withstand. His voice cracked as he sent yet another messenger galloping toward Richard's position. "We cannot hold much longer. Grant us permission to charge, or we die where we stand." Richard's response came back within minutes, carried by a blood-soaked sergeant whose horse had 3 arrow shafts protruding from its neck. "Hold formation. Let them come to us." The king's tactical discipline remained absolute even as his army bled to death around him. But discipline has limits, and the Hospitallers had reached theirs. What happened next would determine whether Christianity survived in the Holy Land or perished in the sand outside Arsuf. The moment that changed everything began with a single knight's moment of uncontrollable rage. Brother Baldwin of Carreo, watching his comrades die under the endless arrow storm while forbidden to strike back, finally snapped. Sources differ on his exact words, but the Itinerarium Regis Riccardi records him shouting something that roughly translates to, "God wills it that we die like warriors, not cattle." He spurred his warhorse forward, alone, directly into the massed ranks of Taqi al-Din's Kurdish cavalry. The psychological effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Seeing one of their brothers charging to certain death triggered an emotional avalanche among the Hospitallers. Marshal Garnier's desperate shouts for order disappeared beneath the thunder of hooves as 300 knights broke formation simultaneously. Not a planned charge, not a tactical decision, but pure battlefield fury made manifest in steel and horseflesh. Here's where legend meets reality. Every military manual written for the next 2 centuries would describe what followed as impossible. 300 heavy cavalry, acting without coordination or support, smashing headlong into 10,000 disciplined Muslim warriors, should have resulted in immediate annihilation. The mathematics were ludicrous, yet within 30 seconds of impact, Taqi al-Din's right wing began to collapse. The secret lay in timing and terrain that Richard had been calculating all morning. Saladin's crescent formation, perfectly positioned for archery harassment, proved catastrophically vulnerable to sudden close assault. The Kurdish cavalry, spread thin across nearly a mile of front, couldn't concentrate enough spears to stop the Christian wedge. Turkish horse archers, deadly at range, found their composite bows useless in melee combat against opponents in full mail armor. Most critically, the Muslim formation had no depth. Break through the front line, and there was nothing behind it except supply wagons and camp followers. Richard faced the most crucial decision of the Third Crusade: support the unauthorized charge and risk losing his entire army in a general melee, or let the Hospitallers die alone and maintain his careful defensive posture. What he chose would echo through centuries of military history. The king who had spent 4 years planning this moment, who had sacrificed thousands of lives to reach this perfect tactical position, who knew that one wrong decision meant the end of Christian presence in the Holy Land, had perhaps 30 seconds to choose between calculated survival and glorious suicide. The sound of Muslim horns screaming retreat signals across Saladin's right wing made the decision for him. Taqi al-Din's 10,000 cavalry were not just retreating, they were fleeing in complete disorder. The sight of Kurdish veterans, conquerors of Damascus and Cairo, running from a handful of Christian knights created a psychological shockwave that rippled across the entire Muslim army. But Richard's real genius lay in what he did next. Instead of committing his entire force to pursue the broken enemy wing, he gave 3 sharp blasts on his war horn. Every Crusader knight knew that signal, had drilled with it for months during the march from Acre. 3 blasts meant one thing: controlled charge through designated gaps in formation. What followed would be remembered as 17 minutes of medieval warfare so perfect it seemed divinely inspired. The first wedge formation struck Saladin's center like a thunderbolt from heaven. 3,000 knights in perfect order, their lances forming an iron wall 20 horses wide, smashed into the Mamluk elite at full gallop. The impact could be heard 3 miles away. Horses screamed, steel shrieked against steel, and 8,000 of Islam's finest warriors discovered that 4 years of unbroken victory meant nothing against this new kind of warfare. Within 60 seconds, Saladin's impenetrable centre had been punched through like parchment. Richard himself led the central wedge, his royal banner streaming behind him as he carved a bloody path through the Mamluk ranks. The Lionheart's blade rose and fell with mechanical precision, each stroke calculated to kill or maim. His household knights followed in arrow formation, their lances finding gaps in Muslim armour with devastating accuracy. Behind them rode the flower of French nobility, 300 knights who had sworn to reclaim Jerusalem or die in the attempt. Their war cries echoed across the battlefield. Deus vult, God wills it. But the real devastation came from tactical innovation that Saladin had never encountered. The Templar wedge, 200 knights strong, struck the Muslim left wing at precisely the moment when Turkish horse archers were repositioning to avoid the central charge. Caught between formations, unable to use their bows effectively, the Turks found themselves fighting a close-quarters battle they were never trained for. European swords, designed to crush through mail and bone, made short work of the lighter armour favoured by horse archers. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. In the first 5 minutes of contact, 1,500 Muslim warriors lay dead or dying. The casualty exchange rate was catastrophic for Saladin's forces. Each fallen knight was immediately replaced by the man behind him, maintaining the wedge's momentum. Each fallen Muslim created a gap that allowed Christian lances to penetrate deeper into the formation. Saladin watched from his command hill as decades of careful recruitment and training disappeared in a storm of steel and horseflesh. Here's what Islamic chroniclers tried to hide about those 17 minutes. The psychological collapse was instant and total. Warriors who had conquered Jerusalem, who had broken Christian armies from Egypt to Syria, began fleeing without orders. Saladin's personal Mamluks, men who had sworn to die rather than retreat, abandoned their posts and rode for the hills. The Sultan found himself virtually alone, his command structure evaporating as panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. The pursuit became a massacre. Richard's disciplined charge transformed into a hunting expedition as broken Muslim cavalry streamed across the plain in complete disorder. Knights who had endured 3 hours of arrow bombardment finally had targets they could reach, and their vengeance was absolute. Turkish horse archers, deadly at range but helpless in close combat, died by the hundreds as they tried to reach the safety of the hills. Taqi al-Din's wing, already shattered by the Hospitaller's unauthorized charge, disintegrated completely when struck by fresh Crusader reserves. 7,000 Kurdish cavalry, the pride of Saladin's right wing, ceased to exist as an organized force. Their commander himself barely escaped, abandoning his war banner and personal equipment in his desperate flight toward Damascus. The most shocking moment came when Richard, blood streaming from a dozen minor wounds, caught sight of Saladin's personal standard less than 200 yards away. For 30 seconds, the fate of the Third Crusade hung in the balance as the English king spurred his warhorse toward the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Muslim bodyguards threw themselves between their lord and the charging Christian king. Richard's lance found its mark twice before superior numbers forced him to wheel away, but the psychological impact was devastating. Saladin had been moments from capture or death. By noon, 35,000 Muslim warriors had been reduced to fewer than 8,000 effective fighters. 7,000 enemy dead carpeted the coastal plain, their blood turning the sand dark beneath the blazing Palestinian sun. Saladin's baggage train, worth a fortune in gold and supplies, fell intact to the Crusaders. Most crushing of all, 32 Muslim commanders lay among the dead, their expertise and experience irreplaceable. Yet in the moment of absolute triumph, Richard made the decision that would haunt the Third Crusade forever. As his knights prepared to pursue the broken enemy army and finish Saladin once and for all, the Lionheart raised his banner and signalled halt. The greatest tactical victory in Crusader history was about to become the greatest strategic mistake. The silence that descended over the battlefield was more terrifying than the screams of battle. Richard's horn signal echoed across the coastal plain, calling his knights back from pursuit, just as Saladin's broken army streamed toward the hills in complete disorder. The greatest tactical victory in Crusader history had lasted exactly 17 minutes, but the decision to end it would echo through centuries. As dust settled over 7,000 Muslim corpses, the true cost of perfect warfare began to reveal itself. The immediate aftermath defied comprehension. Crusader casualties numbered fewer than 700 dead and wounded, a loss rate so minimal it seemed divinely ordained. Yet scattered across 2 miles of blood-soaked sand lay the remnants of Saladin's invincible army. Muslim chroniclers would later claim the Sultan lost only 3,000 men, but Christian sources counted bodies methodically. 7,000 warriors who had awakened that morning expecting easy victory over exhausted crusaders now fed the vultures circling overhead. What shocked even veteran knights was the completeness of the psychological collapse. These weren't the broken remnants of some feudal levy, but professional soldiers who had conquered Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo. Mamluks who had never retreated in their lives abandoned equipment worth fortunes. Turkish horse archers, masters of mounted warfare, threw down their composite bows and fled on foot. Most telling of all, 32 Muslim commanders lay among the dead, their leadership and experience irreplaceable. Brother Garnier de Nablus, whose unauthorized charge had triggered the avalanche, surveyed the wreckage with grim satisfaction. His Hospitallers had suffered 40% casualties during the morning bombardment, but their sacrifice had purchased something beyond price, proof that Saladin could be beaten in open battle. The marshal himself bore 3 arrow wounds and a lance thrust that had punched through his mail, yet he remained in the saddle, directing the collection of wounded and the systematic stripping of enemy dead. But here's what the chronicles don't reveal about Richard's fateful decision to halt pursuit. The Lionheart had calculated that destroying Saladin's army completely would require at least 4 hours of hard riding across broken terrain. His knights were exhausted, their horses blown from the devastating charge. More critically, pursuing a broken enemy meant abandoning the captured baggage train, worth more than the annual revenue of most European kingdoms. Richard chose certain wealth over possible annihilation. The strategic implications became clear within hours. Saladin's escape with 8,000 survivors meant the Third Crusade's primary objective remained unfulfilled. Jerusalem still lay 40 miles inland, its walls intact and its garrison reinforced by the Sultan's retreating forces. The victory at Arsuf had eliminated one Muslim army, but Saladin commanded others. Egypt remained unconquered, Damascus unthreatened. Most crucially, the Sultan himself lived to fight another day. The psychological impact proved even more significant than the tactical result. For 4 years, Christian Europe had watched helplessly as Saladin rolled up Crusader territories like parchment. Hattin had established Muslim military superiority as an article of faith. Arsuf shattered that perception completely. Word of Richard's victory would reach London, Paris, and Rome within months, revitalizing support for the Crusade and inspiring fresh recruitment drives across the continent. Yet among the Crusader leadership, doubt crept in like poison. Raymond of Tripoli, surveying the battlefield carnage, posed the question that would haunt Richard for the rest of his life. If we can slaughter them so completely in open battle, why do we not march directly to Jerusalem while they still reel from this defeat? The king's response revealed the strategic paralysis that would define the remainder of the Third Crusade. We are too few to besiege the Holy City while Saladin's field army remains intact. The cruel mathematics were inescapable. Richard could win every battle, but he could not win the war. Saladin would learn from Arsuf, avoiding pitched battles while bleeding the Crusaders through attrition and harassment. The Sultan had lost an army, but preserved his kingdom. The Lionheart had achieved the impossible, but gained nothing beyond a single day's glory. As evening fell over the coastal plain, Smoke from burning enemy equipment filled the air with the acrid smell of victory turned Pyrrhic. The king, who had crushed 30,000 warriors in 17 minutes, discovered that some triumphs contained the seeds of ultimate defeat. The ripple effects of those 17 minutes would determine the fate of Christianity in the East for the next 7 centuries. Within days of the victory, Richard's army captured Jaffa without resistance, establishing the crucial supply base he had risked everything to obtain. But Saladin, bloodied and humiliated, had learned the lesson that would ultimately save his empire. Never again would he offer pitched battle to concentrated crusader forces. The Sultan, who had built his reputation on military audacity, transformed overnight into a master of defensive warfare and strategic patience. The tactical revolution unleashed at Arsuf spread across medieval Europe like wildfire. Richard's coordinated wedge formations, combining disciplined infantry with precisely timed cavalry charges, became the template for every major military power. The Swiss pike squares that would dominate European battlefields for the next 3 centuries traced their lineage directly to the formations that shattered Saladin's army. Military academies from Paris to Vienna still study the Lionheart's perfect timing, the way he transformed a desperate defensive action into crushing offensive victory through sheer force of will and tactical genius. Yet the strategic consequences proved devastating for Christian ambitions. Saladin's survival at Arsuf allowed him to implement the scorched earth campaign that would strangle the Third Crusade. Instead of seeking decisive battles he knew he would lose, the Sultan bled the Crusaders through constant harassment, supply interdiction, and psychological warfare. Richard's perfect tactical weapon proved useless against an enemy who refused to fight. The king, who could destroy 30,000 warriors in minutes, found himself helpless against thousands of individual raiders who struck at dawn and vanished into the desert. The psychological impact cut both ways. Arsuf entered Christian mythology as proof that faith and discipline could overcome impossible odds, inspiring recruitment drives that drew tens of thousands of volunteers to subsequent crusades. Yet it also taught Muslim commanders that Western heavy cavalry, properly deployed, was nearly unstoppable in open battle. This lesson shaped Islamic military doctrine for generations, emphasizing mobility, defensive positions, and avoiding the kind of concentrated assault that had proved so catastrophic. Here's the cruel irony that haunts military historians. Richard's mercy at Arsuf, his decision to preserve his army rather than pursue total victory, made strategic sense but guaranteed ultimate failure. The king, who understood battlefield tactics with scientific precision, proved incapable of strategic thinking beyond the immediate engagement. By saving Saladin's life, he condemned Jerusalem to remain in Muslim hands for another 700 years. When the Ottomans finally fell in 1917, British officers entering the Holy City carried maps drawn from Richard's reconnaissance reports. The human cost became clear only in retrospect. Those 700 Crusader casualties represented irreplaceable military expertise that could never be rebuilt. Each fallen knight had required years of training and equipment worth more than most villages. The 17-minute victory consumed resources that the Crusader states could not afford, no matter how spectacular the exchange rate. Saladin's 7,000 dead, by contrast, could be replaced within months from the vast recruiting grounds of Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. Modern warfare bears the invisible imprint of Arsuf in ways most generals never recognize. The principle that discipline and timing can overcome numerical superiority echoes through every military academy, from West Point to Sandhurst. Richard's coordinated combined arms tactics, integrating infantry squares with cavalry charges, established patterns that would dominate European warfare until the invention of gunpowder. The psychological lesson proved equally enduring. Impossible odds mean nothing if you can force the enemy to fight on your terms at the moment of your choosing. September 7th, 1191. The pre-dawn darkness that had hidden 20,000 desperate crusaders gave way to blazing noon that revealed 7,000 Muslim dead. Yet the king who achieved the impossible, who crushed Saladin's finest warriors in 17 minutes of perfect warfare, discovered that some victories are too complete to be strategic. In proving that discipline could triumph over desperation, Richard the Lionheart wrote the greatest tactical masterpiece in Crusader history and ensured that Jerusalem would never be his.